Hello, this is Pastor Deborah Mitchell of Love and Mercy Fellowship located in Bayshore, New York. And I'd like to welcome you to Christianity and the Old Testament. And I'd like to talk today a little bit about Exodus 17:13, about what it is to thirst and what it is to trust in God, what it is to live in the moment, trusting. Exodus 17:13 says, "And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured there, and murmured because of water." Now, the Hebrew word for thirsty is yisema, which means an overwhelming desire for either the natural or the hidden knowledge of God. And this verse follows the story of Israel crossing through the desert on their way to the promised land. In Exodus 17, verse 1, God commands the children of Israel to stop and make camp at a place called Rephidim. It's a wonder that God asks them to camp in this area, because not only was there no water there, but they were there later also. They were there, and they were later attacked at the gates by the enemy at the gates of Rephidim. From all human reasoning, this was not the place to set up camp. But the Bible only says that there was no water at Rephidim. It does not say Israel was without water. It says there was no water at Rephidim. Chances are they had to have carried water with them. And one reason to set up camp would be to replenish your supply of water. It stands to reason. You camp where you can get water. But here God had them camp at a place where there was no water. So they were to stay there until, we know the story all through the desert wanderings, that they would stay in a place until God moved the cloud. God doesn't move the cloud, they're staying where they are. God begins to move the cloud. They knew they had to break down camp, tear down the tents, and start traveling and follow the cloud. Whithersoever that cloud went, that's where they went. They had to stay where they were until God said it was okay to move on. Otherwise, they'd be moving on without God in their midst. And when the clouds started to move, they moved. But the cloud did not move. As each day passed, the water that they had brought with them to the camp was slowly being used up and deplenishing. And God says in Exodus 17, verse 3, that the people thirsted there. Now the word thirst, as I said before, is in the Hebrew, it is yisama. And it comes from the root word sama, which means thirsty. But it also has the idea of an overwhelming desire for things, either in the natural world or of God. Every English translation says the people were thirsty, past tense. One version even says they were tormented by thirst. And the word again in the Hebrew is yisema. Now the yod, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, is the letter that's in the front of that word yisema. It's the first letter in the word. And it's that little tittle that we're commanded not to remove because it's important. It gives us some very important insight into this story. The yud puts that word into a form, a simple imperfect kal form. Hold on, it's a little technical sounding, but just bear with me a little bit, put your seatbelt on, and let me just say this. It's not an intensive form, but it's in a simple form. Imperfect, incomplete action that's often rendered as a future tense. So they were not tormented by thirst. They were not dying of thirst. And in fact, they were not thirsty at all. But they were filled with the desire for the flesh. Being in an imperfect or future tense kind of suggests that they were gonna be thirsty. They were not there yet. They were afraid of what was gonna happen in a few weeks. And the question was, what were they gonna be thirsty for? They had enough water for the day, maybe for the next day, maybe for even longer, maybe for the next 2 weeks. They were not thirsty yet. They had not reached that point of being thirsty. They had not reached a crisis stage, but it was looming and it was out there and it was in the back of their minds and right in front of them. So they began to murmur. Can you imagine them sitting around the campfire at night, belly aching? Oh, that crazy Moses. Where has he brought us to now? Why does he make us camp at a place where there's no water? We can't dig for water here. If we don't leave now, we will never have enough water to make it to the next oasis. Not only that, he'll probably make us stay until the water is gone, and then we'll have to travel in the sand, in the desert, in the heat, and we'll die of thirst right out here in the wilderness. But Moses was not worried about the water. He might have been thirsty, just like the rest of them, but his thirst was for the hidden knowledge of God. His thirst was not for the natural things that the others were after, like security for their own fleshly desires. Moses was just focused on obedience to God. You see, if God wanted them to camp at Rephidim, then by golly, they were going to camp at Rephidim, water or no water. But the people were focused on the natural world and not on the eternal things. I mean, it always baffles me, and we always think we would have done a better job of believing and obeying, you know, especially if we had seen the locusts coming down and the frogs coming down and the firstborn of Egypt's children and cattle and everything dying. If we had seen all those miracles, the Red Sea parting, the bed of the Red Sea dry as anything, so that our feet didn't slip as we walked through the waters. If we had seen the manna coming down every morning, the pillar of fire at night and the cloud by day, oh man, if I had been there, if I had seen that, how could they not believe? How could they think that God was going to leave them hanging? We always think that we'd have a little bit more faith than the disciples especially. I mean, Jesus was constantly rebuking his disciples, "O ye of little faith." After he had done miracle after miracle. Imagine this. Imagine you're in a revival meeting with Jesus and everyone sick, whether it was with the palsy, whether it was, leprosy, whatever it was, everybody that was brought to him, he healed them all. Not one person left Jesus' presence unhealed. And still, he calls his disciples, he says, "O ye of little faith." Wow. How? How could that be? But you see, Moses was focused on obedience to God. He was focused on obeying what God had directed him to do. He was not focused on the provision because he knew God would provide. Where God guides, God provides. And that's the plain fact. I tell you, when I came into ministry, I came in with, I left everything. I left the proposal of three different contracts to teach in a city that was a good paying job. These were good paying jobs with good benefits. I walked away from it. I had one pair of shoes, 2 blouses, 1 skirt. Walked into full-time ministry and lived by faith for 9 years. I never wanted for a toothbrush, for a bar of soap. I never had a need that God didn't bless me with. But one time an Yvonne Picone suit was mailed to me in the mail. The day I was waiting for my ride to take me to the airport to go to revival meetings, and I was just looking at my wardrobe and thinking how little I had to bring. And a beautiful suit, a designer suit, tweed, wool tweed, lined I mean, this was a nice suit. Sent through the mail, UPS man, blessed my soul. God will provide. Whatever it is you have need of, he will provide. Moses was just focused on obeying God, and if God wanted them to camp there, they were going to stay there. But the people were focused on fear. They were focused on the natural instead of the eternal things, instead of spiritual things, and they began to murmur. I want to ask you today, are you camped at Rephidim? Are you at a place where you're fearful because you're thinking down the road instead of the present time? Maybe you just received that layoff notice, a pink slip. Maybe you just received a medical report from the doctor. I tell you what, I was at the doctor's the other day, the chiropractor's, the results of an MRI, and he began to give me the bad news. And I just looked at him, I started to laugh. He said, no, this is, your discs are out of place. Yeah, this is serious, Debbie. And I continued to laugh. Because God is in control of that report. I'm believing God for a miracle. And that's where it doesn't matter if you had the pink slip handed to you. It doesn't matter what the doctor report says. It doesn't matter when that unexpected bill comes in. Or it doesn't matter that you're going through a failed relationship. God will heal and restore and rejuvenate anything that you place into his hands. And in his timing, he will take you through it. He will provide you with everything you need. But I'll tell you the truth, you're going to learn something in the trial. I remember a story, and I'm digressing from my notes a little bit, but it pertains. So the silversmith is trying to refine gold. And as he's heating up the pot of gold, all the dross that was in the gold was coming to the surface, and he's skimming it off, and somebody's watching him clearly. And he says, well, how do you know when it's done? And the refiner looks at him and he says, when I can see without blemish my reflection in the top of the pot of gold, that's when I know it's purified. God is looking for the reflection of himself in us. When we've been in the fire and it's been heated up more than it needs to be, and we think that there's, we can't take any more, but that dross and all the fleshly things are coming out to the surface, and he's just skimming it out. He's letting us see it so that we can agree for him to remove it. He knows it's there, but he wants to purify us. It reminds me also of a time, I don't know if anybody watching has ever done any pottery work, but I used to love to go to pottery classes. I took it in college, and it was a wonderful experience because I knew the scriptures about God being the potter and we being the clay. And I learned some things about the urn that they would put the clay after they've dried out the clay, and after a certain amount of time you've made this vessel and you've dried it out and you've shaped it, and now you have to fire it before you can paint it again. It has to go through a process of firings. Firings are when you put it in the kiln and you heat up that kiln gets heated up to over 1,500 degrees. And before they had electric kilns where it would tell you what the temperature was, in ancient days, they used to depend on something that was unheard of in modern days. One time somebody asked a potter, how do you know when to remove the vessel from the fire? He says, it begins to hum. It actually lets off a tone. And I'll tell you the truth. When are you coming out of that tribulation? When are you coming out of that trial? When you begin to sing. when you begin to worship, when you begin to say, God, I don't know how long I have to be here, but I'm going to praise you through it. I'm going to praise you in the here and now. It doesn't matter if I have to be here another month, another 2 months, another year. I'm going to praise you through this. And I tell you what, when he hears your hum, when he hears your song, when he hears your worship, he'll know you're ready. And he'll remove you from that kiln, that fire of tribulation. And it's then that you can become that vessel of honor, ready to have something poured into you so that you can pour out to others. You have substance to give to somebody else. If you're camped at Rephidim, if you're at a place where you're unemployed and you don't know where the next rent bill is coming from, your next grocery bill, if you're experiencing a failed marriage or a prodigal child has run away from home or your daughter's on drugs, I'm telling you, if you're fretting like Israel has over the fear of no water, the fear of lack of funds, of money drying up, of your health failing, your marriage falling apart, I'm here to tell you, God is able. God is able to give you water at Rephidim. If you're fretting over no water, even before you're thirsty, get a hold of yourself. Start speaking to yourself the word of God. If you're fretting over no water before you get thirsty, yet you're thirsty in the sense of yisema, you're filled with desire. But what is it that you're desiring? What is it that you're thirsting for? Are you thirsting and desiring natural security, or do you seek to use your experience for the flip side? To discover the hidden secrets of the God who loves you. To discover exactly what he has for you. You know, it's in those places of trial that you will feel God the most. You know, I remember my mentor, Sister Celeste Horvath, who had been redeemed from a life of crime, drugs, and prostitution. She was a madam in New York City, and a famous one at that. She had been in the papers. And the first time she was arrested, God gave her grace. The newspapers were on strike, and she was given a warning, but she fell right back into the same lifestyle and was arrested again 2 years later. And this time she was going to do jail time because they had so much publicity, because the district attorney at the time was running for office. And so they kept her name in the papers. It was awful what the family went through, everything. But she says that when one of the greatest times in her life where she felt the greatest presence of God was that first month. Back then in the 60s, there were 8-watt bulbs in those cells. There was no air conditioning. You didn't have the niceties that prisons have now. The civil rights movement had not taken place. It was just beginning to start. And so there were no, practically, there were very little rights afforded a prisoner in those days. And she remembers, she said, the times I felt the presence of God strongest was when I was in solitary confinement. She said there was no window. There was not even bars. There was just a door with a very small opening for the meal tray to come through, and nothing that where she could look out of that door. And she would lay on that cot praying, and she said rays of light would come through the wall, and the presence of God would so fill that room. She felt like she was in the throne room itself in heaven. She said, never in my ministry life, even many years of ministry after that, she said that was the place I felt the presence of God the strongest. And we had been in some glorious revival meetings where God healed people, but still, she said, it was her testimony. The place she felt the greatest presence was in the greatest trial. In the heat of that moment, God came. Jesus told the woman at the well that had been despised by all the other women, and we know that she was despised because she's coming at noon for her water. Nobody in the Middle East goes to the well at noon because that's when the sun is beginning to come at its strength. You go in the morning hours when it's cooler. But she was so despised by her community that she came out. And Jesus began a conversation with her, and he said, if you knew the one who was talking to you, you would ask. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Living water. Are you thirsting? Are you desiring natural security, or do you seek the presence of God? Jesus answered to her in chapter 4 of John, the Gospel of John. He said, everyone who drinks this water, speaking of the well that he was sitting by, will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water that I give them, they will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. In the King James, it calls it a wellspring. A wellspring is where you have a natural bubbling up of water. It never stops. There's no end to it. You don't have to dig for this spring. It comes up naturally. That's what he offers us today. Living water. He is a God who is touched with the infirmities, the feelings of our infirmities, Hebrews tells us. He's no stranger to our pain. He wants to meet you where you are. He wants to quench that thirst that's in your soul, in your life. And it's as simple as asking him to come and fill you. It's just that simple. Lord Jesus, come fill me. Give me that water. I'm thirsty for you. It's that simple. I like to say simple, just not easy for some people to give up the desires that have been so embedded into their nature. You're used to feeding on junk food. You don't want the real good food. You're filled up by the time the steak comes out. Feast on junk food long enough and you lose your appetite for the real good stuff. But when you feast on whole foods and natural foods and healthy foods, you don't desire, after a while, you don't desire the junk food. It tastes awful to you. Either it's too salty, too sweet, too chemical tasting. We need to learn to thirst for the right things. Thirst for that which satisfies. I remember reading a book, a very good book, by Jamie Buckingham. I don't remember what the title of the book was, but Jamie Buckingham used to run tours through the Sinai, tracing the steps of Israel through the Sinai. And there was many groups that he brought through on these tours, and he would always advise them to drink a certain amount of, they were always advised, drink a certain amount of water every day. And there was one gentleman who just would not listen to and heed that warning. Coming from a state that was usually very hot in the U.S., he thought he'd get by drinking his Coca-Cola and drinking his coffee, until one night he collapsed. His kidneys were beginning to really go. I mean, he was urinating black. And the doctor there was a doctor on that trip, put a gallon of water, and he said, put it in front of him as he lay there in the sand, just writhing in pain. And he said, by a certain hour of the day, this gallon needs to be finished. You need to drink this or you're going to die. Boy, that cleared that man. That cured that man of that that rebellion where he wouldn't listen to the advice of those who were experienced in the desert. When we thirst for things that are not going to help us, it goes against us, it works against us. But Jesus promised, he promised, if we would but come to that living water, everyone who drinks the water I give him will never thirst again. Indeed, the water I give them will be a wellspring, springing up. It doesn't fade. It doesn't go away. He wants to do that for you today. Would you do that? Would you let him come in? I encourage you, just call out to the Lord and ask him to help you thirst for the things that really matter in life. And when you do, you'll come through that trial. You'll go through that fire, and you'll come out singing. You'll come out with a song. You'll come out with a testimony. I guarantee it. I pray that you've enjoyed this message today. Please, would you do me a favor and hit the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen and allow for notifications so that you don't miss anything? And we'll join you next time. Until then, may the Lord richly bless you and yours.